but let's watch. Oh, is this Radhika Desai? I love Radhika Desai. All right, I want to watch this panel. Actually, the person, or I was talking about neoliberalism in relation to Ramiro's video, but one of the main people who I learned about the history of economics from, and like the transition from classical into neoclassical economics, was this lady right here. There's a really good video. I'll just pull it up real quick so people have it. Capitalism. This is like an hour and a half interview on reading Capital. It's one of the best interviews ever. This will really help anyone who's trying to read Capital. So there you go, and there she is.
Thank you very much.
All right, let's watch Daniel Dumbrill. This 12-minute clip that went semi-viral, 300,000 views. Wow. Yeah, let's check it out.
Thank you.
Daniel Dumbrill, for those who don't know, is a journalist stationed in China. So,
welcome everybody. Hello, it's nice to be here with you today. So in my talk here, I just wanted to talk about why the Xinjiang narratives matter so much to Western governments right now, particularly the U.S. And a spoiler alert, it's not because they really care about the Muslims, but I want to talk about why this campaign has been so successful, though. As we know, Canadian Parliament recently voted on a motion to call what's going on in Xinjiang a genocide. It passed with overwhelming support, and I actually wanted to reach out to one of the MPs to find out a bit more about what went into the decision-making process. I reached out to 80 MPs who voted yes on the motion, including some on the subcommittee who were even more active with pushing this forward. I explained that I have a channel with over 100,000 subscribers, but every single one of them either ignored or refused the request. There was one single Conservative MP from Parry Sound, Scott Atchison, who did agree. But as we approached the agreed upon date, a few hours before the interview, Scott's office abruptly canceled and said that they weren't interested in rescheduling. It, of course, at least to me, is quite apparent that they looked at my channel and found out that I might have a bit of a different take on the situation, and my show might include questions that are uncomfortable to answer. But I wasn't actually looking for a confrontation. I genuinely wanted to understand how they were briefed and who was involved. I actually empathize with their desire to vote yes and don't really hold it against them personally. This is even despite the fact they are confident enough to use such a strong term to describe the situation in Xinjiang and prop up the idea of even boycotting the Beijing Olympics, yet seem to lack the confidence to engage with potentially difficult questions.
And I'm so not surprised that these people from the U.S. State Department didn't want to go on Dumbrill's show, because he would have made them look ridiculous. I don't know if anyone remembers, but when, I've talked about this a lot before, but they had Jim McGovern, a handful of TikTokers had Jim McGovern, this U.S. congressman, one of the main people pushing this Uighur narrative of genocide and pushing for regime change in China. A handful of TikTokers had him on to interview him about the sanctions, and a lot of them were basically just patting him on the back, you know, like providing no pushback. But Adrian Antinoli got in that Zoom chat, and everyone knows Adrian was one of the main people who was skeptical about this narrative surrounding Xinjiang. He got in there and he started providing pushback to Jim McGovern, and the guy couldn't answer any of his questions. And Adrian was like 18 years old, TikTok creator at the time. And this congressman, one of the main people pushing this narrative about Xinjiang to try and create regime change with China, or create consent for regime change in China, was stumped by an 18-year-old kid on TikTok asking very, very basic questions, questioning this narrative surrounding Xinjiang. So I am not surprised that members of the U.S. State Department pushing this narrative saw who Daniel Dumbrill was and said, no way I'm going on this dude's show.
One of the things I really wanted to figure out was if there was any concern that the U.S. government is putting so much money behind this narrative, funding overseas Uyghur groups millions of dollars and dedicating a lot of airtime towards it, and what this kind of effort usually means. We have a precedent for fake propaganda created to serve America's geopolitical interests, whether it be the weapons of mass destruction or fake incubator baby stories, and a host of other fake human rights abuses or false flag operations. And they have very good reason to want to disrupt China and its relationships. China's economy is now set to overtake America's sooner than expected. Resource-rich countries finally have a non-Western option for cooperative partnerships, China, and they're increasingly choosing that option, particularly in America's old stronghold of Latin America, countries who have suffered under the brutality of American government operations for a long time. Chinese telecommunication companies are offering new non-American options, which are, of course, being slandered as having backdoors, according to the accusations of a country that has constantly wiretapped the phones of even allied countries. And there's an increasing risk that the renminbi will challenge the US dollar's global hegemony. We can see that with the potential of the digital renminbi and many other international settlements now being done in renminbi, effectively circumventing American sanctions, which are designed to strangle governments and kill its people.
The U.S. has been unable to do hybrid war against China. Their sanction campaign and all of their economic warfare efforts that have been so effective against other countries, against much smaller nations like Venezuela, Cuba, the DPRK. China has been so good at circumnavigating these, and Daniel Dumbrill is going into the specifics of why. And you can see why the U.S. is so hell-bent on destabilizing China and seeing regime change in China. We talk about this all the time on this show. On how imperialism in the 21st century is really, really heavily focused on economic warfare, and how since World War II, these financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank and others have come together, backed by the West, heavily controlled by the West, and have given Western imperialist powers incredible power on the global stage to strangle countries using sanctions and other methods of economic warfare. China is getting around these and now using their Belt and Road Initiative to offer other countries, paths of development, ways to develop themselves without having to engage with these Western financial institutions. And that is so dangerous for the U.S. in maintaining their global dominance, right? Maintaining their this system of U.S. hegemony and Western hegemony. China is really, really, really challenging that in the 21st century. And yeah, the more work I see from Daniel Dumbrill, the more I really like him. He's oftentimes going into the details about these things that so rarely get talked about in Western media.
Add the context of Xinjiang being the site of Asia's largest oil deposits and the fact that it's a key doorway to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and that it suffered from pre-existing Islamic terrorism problems, the question suddenly becomes, how could you possibly not expect America to take a special interest in Xinjiang? And not because of human rights, knowing full well America's history. From what I've found about the initiative in Canada so far on my own, and with the help of a group called the Canada Files, there wasn't any meaningful pushback on the narrative or concern about being used for America's geopolitical interests. On the contrary, one of the main contributors was from the Uighur Rights Advocacy Project, a Canadian NGO set up with funds from the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, or an organization who Max Blumenthal had pointed out that had its president say that what the CIA used to do covertly, they now do through the NED.
I was just about to pause it and say the NED is basically like a private version of the CIA. And, because they've said it out loud, like we're basically meant to do what the CIA does. Except the CIA is a direct arm of the U.S. State Department, whereas the NED is private, so they're not technically connected to the State Department, to the U.S. government. So they're, they almost have more freedom than the CIA to get in these other countries and do things to destabilize these other countries, like funneling money into opposition groups and extremist groups, which they might get into later here.
This is basically a front to overthrow and destabilize governments, and it has nothing to do with democracy. They'll be just fine with overthrowing a democratically elected leader with a dictator if it serves America's geopolitical and corporate interests well enough. Going back to the Canadian vote, with all this in mind, why would I empathize with the MPs who voted yes on this motion? Aside from a very careful weaponization of compassion, the personal and professional consequences of voting yes on this genocide motion, and later finding out it was just another giant propaganda campaign, are far less than the consequences of voting no and finding out later a genocide was really going on.
And I want to hear how he's going to finish this thought here, but I wanted to point out a term that he uses that I really like is weaponization of compassion. Right, because what is the main accusation made against me and anybody else who is expressing skepticism about this narrative surrounding China and surrounding Xinjiang? It's, oh, you're a genocide denier. You don't care about Muslim people, right? It must be that you just support genocide. You don't care about Muslim people. It can't be that you're questioning, the narratives being pushed by Western media. When, of course, if there was a genocide going on, if there were these horrible crimes against Muslim people, me and a lot of other people like Daniel Dumbrill would be the first ones to call it out, right? And would be the first ones to be reporting on it and to be talking about it. It's just the fact that the evidence for this doesn't add up on the ground, and the U.S. has had such a long history of using accusations of human rights abuses as justification to invade countries and kill millions of people. So when they're claiming that there's a human rights going on the ground, human rights abuse that's going on in a country, China, where there's been increasing hostility between them and the U.S. Throughout recent history, it only makes sense to be skeptical and to make sure that all the evidence is there before you make accusations of genocide. But they weaponize your compassion, right? So it's like, you don't care about the Muslim people. You don't care about genocide. You are a bad person. You are a non-compassionate, evil person because you are questioning this narrative, because you are skeptical of the accusation that there's a genocide going on in Xinjiang. When in reality, nothing could be farther from the truth. Of course I would be upset if there was a genocide going on. Of course I would be, drawing attention to that using my platform. But, I'm not going to immediately accept whatever the U.S. State Department tells me without actual evidence, without looking into the evidence. And when you look into the evidence is when they weaponize compassion, right? You need to be compassionate, and you need to tell these people who are questioning the narrative of genocide in Xinjiang to shut up, because they're not compassionate, right? They don't care about genocide. They don't care about Uighur Muslims. It's like, yes, I do, but, I'm not going to carry water for narratives of the U.S. State Department that might lead to millions of people being killed if those narratives are not true, if there's not evidence for them, and the more you watch journalists who are in China, actually on the ground in China, actually investigating in Xinjiang, the more questions you will have about this narrative of genocide coming from the U.S. State Department and from the NED.
So in the absence of enough information, it's clear how they'd vote, and the importance of having their voter base, who have been propagandized into a strong position on the topic, must see that their elected MP voted the correct way. I'm not going to get into the problematic nature of all of the evidence. I suspect Max might touch on that a little bit, but almost none of it stands up to even the most basic logical and critical questions, whether it be the ridiculous formulas used to make the multi-million estimates, or the testimonies like that of Tursane, a supposed concentration camp survivor who was propped up in a major way by CNN and BBC recently, and is someone who's on the third version of her story, wildly deviating from the first, and whose passport renewal date was oddly the only thing blurred out by the CNN report, because it turns out it's a giant hole in the story that nobody's talking about. It would be odd enough if China would grant a passport to someone they're trying to genocide, but it would be even more odd that her passport was renewed during the time she said she was under arrest. So the need to blur that out becomes quite apparent now. But this obvious deceit and hole-filled narrative that doesn't remotely resemble honest journalism doesn't matter, because people are...
And another thing, talking about this weaponizing of compassion, and I believe I talked about this on the last show, this very large TikToker called me out when I was expressing skepticism about the U.S. narratives in Xinjiang. And he said, we need to believe survivors. That was his argument. Eddie is just not believing survivors. Again, I'm not compassionate. I just don't care enough about these people, these Uighur Muslims, right? That's why I'm expressing concern, is the way they try and portray it, right? Oh, Eddie just doesn't believe survivors. Oh, he's not compassionate enough. Meanwhile, when you look into the stories of some of these supposed survivors, like Daniel Dumbrill did here, apparently this person is someone who China is attempting to genocide and who China had locked up. And on their passport, or they had granted her a passport, which shows that, that shows inconsistency with the idea that China is granting a passport and trying to genocide this person. And also the date on the passport that it was granted was the date when this person was supposedly locked up. Right, when China supposedly had this person behind bars was the date that they got their passport renewed. So this weaponization of compassion is coming from people who just aren't looking into the details, right? Like James Gets Political is the person on TikTok who called me out for like not believing survivors. It's like, well, James, how much have you looked into the people who are pushing this narrative? Because a lot of them are deeply tied to the NED, deeply tied to the U.S. State Department, and there's, very little evidence that they were actually ever locked up in supposed concentration camps. So it's just people who are having their compassion preyed on by the State Department. I don't think James is a bad person, right, for coming at me like that, but I think the State Department has preyed on his compassion, right? So he feels like he has to come out here and say, no, there is a genocide going on. I need to say there's a genocide going on, otherwise I'm a bad person, and I'm going to critique Eddie and say that he's a bad person if he doesn't say there's a genocide going on. When in reality, we should all just be looking into the narrative of genocide and asking for more evidence, right? Where is the evidence? Show me the evidence. I will, believe something if I see adequate evidence to believe it, but until then, I will remain skeptical.
Also frightened out of asking questions. I want to give you a personal example of that. My father, who doesn't necessarily agree with all of my views, of course, and is naturally concerned for the Uyghurs, as I would be too in his position, receiving the information that he is, and particularly because he's a professor of social work, specializing in anti-oppressive practices, and has even written a book on the topic used by universities. He actually does empathize with my point that anytime America says they want to liberate a people's suspicion, at least in regard to the true intentions, is probably a healthy thing to have. In an academic theology form he contributes towards, he asked the question whether we should be concerned about the intentions behind the narrative and if it really is in the best interests of the Uyghur population, or it's being used to satisfy some sort of a Western imperialistic agenda. His question was, how do we support the Uyghurs and how do we help them without being used as a tool? With this mild statement in mind, my father was labeled a genocide denier. Not even in a theology form full of academics was he allowed to ask a question or to even question the intentions, even as a person who is concerned about what might be happening in Xinjiang.
And that's where it starts to get disgusting, right? The blackballing of anybody from academia who questions these State Department narratives. And this is, very similar to what happened to Michael Parenti during the Cold War for expressing criticism of the narratives about the USSR, right? As the USSR was still an existing thing, not talking about it in hindsight like we often do, right? He was blackballed from academia because the U.S. had the Cold War going on. They didn't want academics expressing critiques of U.S. narratives about the USSR. They wanted everybody to believe that the USSR was just this horrible hellscape where they were torturing their people so that they would give the U.S. military and the CIA the thumbs up to drop bombs on any country supported by the USSR. It's the exact same thing with China now, right? And his dad, a theology professor there, doesn't even express criticism towards the narratives of genocide, right? All he says is, let's think about how we're allowing ourselves to be used as tools of the U.S. State Department. And that got him labeled as a genocide denier, right? That got him not blackballed from academia, but so much pushback from academia just saying, hey, let's not be tools of the U.S. State Department. I mean, it's truly incredible, and it's incredible the kind of culture and environment there is in Western academia where you're really not allowed to speak out against certain narratives, even in, colleges, in places where you'd think like intellectual freedom and freedom of thought would be the most allowed and the most encouraged. Nope, you're not allowed to express criticism about narratives directly coming from the U.S. State Department or from Adrian Zenz, this man who says he's on a mission from God to destroy China. If you do that, you're just a genocide denier. Gotta go.
Now, take that one step further. Imagine someone who actually is skeptical of the whole narrative and are seeing these massive red flags. There's no room for them in society to talk about it. Consent is being manufactured, scaring people into a specific narrative. Not only did we not learn about the risks of fake weapons of mass destruction-like stories being accepted by the masses, but we didn't learn from the problematic phrase used by George Bush during that time. You're either with us or you're against us. There's no room to question the narrative. You can't stand in the middle while trying to figure things out. Instead, now, we're expected to believe that a population in China that has been growing faster than the majority Han Chinese, in part because they weren't subject to the one-child policy, where they have 20,000 mosques built for them, where their script is written on all the national currency, something we don't even do for our indigenous populations in Canada.
Or in the U.S.,
where the biggest star in China is a Uyghur woman who was recently signed on by LV as their brand ambassador, where Uyghur kids can get into top universities easier than Han Chinese and have specific halal foods prepared for them in the canteen and prayer areas on campus. We're expected to believe that this population is being eradicated. It's a ridiculous statement, whether it be in a literal sense or even a cultural sense. I think it's safe to say, from historical...
I like that he points out the cultural sense, too, and gives specific arguments or specific evidence to refute that claim. Because that's what a lot of people will say then, right, is they'll say, oh, there's a genocide going on, and you say, well, the population of Uyghur is growing faster than the population of Han Chinese. And then they'll respond, oh, well, it's a cultural genocide. Well, they're destroying mosques. And it's like, well, 20,000 mosques have been built in Xinjiang, and you can also express, he also gave a lot of evidence there expressing criticism of the narrative of cultural genocide, which, this idea of cultural genocide is probably something that the U.S. State Department really just cooked up so they could accuse China, right, of doing something with the word genocide in it. But I don't know. And there are real criticisms to make of the Chinese government, right? Like, in their government bureaucracy, and Daniel Dumbrill talks about this. There's discrimination that Uyghur people face. There's discrimination in everyday life. There's been some discrimination in policing. It's not like this doesn't exist, but to take it to the extent of saying there is a cultural erasure, a cultural genocide, it just doesn't, it doesn't add up when you look at the facts on the ground.
Historical precedents. The fact that America recently pardoned a convicted soldier who shot a 14-year-old boy through the head in Iraq, along with a number of other unarmed civilians, which barely made a blip in the news. The fact that, and this person was recently pardoned and released from his life sentence. The fact that we're not looking at how to hold Australia accountable for events we have literal footage of, where the SAS soldiers, jumping out of a helicopter, shot an innocent farmer face down in his fields who was holding his prayer beads. And the fact that the U.S. sanctioned not only the International Criminal Court members looking into U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, but also their family members. This isn't really about human rights and a care for overseas Muslims.
Exactly. You really, really are going to stand here and you're going to tell me that the United States cares about Muslims. Right, assume that all the narratives are true, right? We should, of course, and we should express concern, and we should look into these accusations and these narratives, and we should remain critical of China, of course. But you're telling me that the United States is concerned about Muslim people, that they're just freaking out oh, we got to get China, not because of what China's doing economically, right? Not because China is the fastest rising power in the world and they're challenging U.S. dominance. We have to get China because we care so deeply about their Muslim population. It's did you not just kill millions of people in Iraq? Did you not just murder millions of civilians in Iraq? Are you not funding a genocide in Palestine? You're going to tell me the U.S. State Department cares so deeply about Muslims? Please give me a break.
Hypocritical Western nations and problematic narratives aside, I want to talk about the risks that come from brainlessly swallowing and regurgitating this propaganda. 62% of Canadians now support a more hardline approach towards China. Americans have also been convinced that they need to be more aggressive with China. Consent has been manufactured for American...
And I see this stuff on TikTok all the time. There are TikToks where it'll just be some dramatic music, and then it'll be a teenager, and they'll be just a reminder, there's a genocide going on in China, and dramatic music, and bam, that's the whole video. It's 10 seconds long, and it'll have millions of views. It's this stuff is dangerous, right? It is dangerous that our whole country is building this hatred towards China and this hatred towards the other. The two most powerful countries in the world right now. Not that China thinks the same way towards us, but there's all this hatred and anger. And of course, you're seeing the increase in hate crimes towards Asian Americans here on U.S. soil, which is exactly what happened during the War on Terror when George Bush and all these neocons were telling us that we needed to go over into West Asia and bomb these countries and kill all these people to fight the War on Terror. You saw an increase in hate crimes towards Muslim people here on American soil. Now it's the exact same thing with Chinese people. It is such dangerous rhetoric that they're pushing, and this is why it's so important to be critical about the Xinjiang narratives, even though we're living at a time where if you express criticism of this, you are smeared as a genocide denier and as someone who just doesn't care about human rights. But that's what it always is, right? That's the same thing that it was if in the early 2000s you were saying Saddam Hussein doesn't have weapons of mass destruction, right? They would have been saying, oh, you don't care about human rights, you don't care about fighting terrorism, you don't care about the people who died on 9/11 because you don't support the Iraq War, and you don't believe Saddam Hussein doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. And now everybody's against the Iraq War, right? 20 years later, everyone can look back in hindsight and be like, oh yeah, there were no weapons of mass destruction, and the Iraq War was a disaster that killed millions of people. But at the time they were still trying to lie us into Iraq. A lot of those people were still supporting it. And, don't fall for the same thing here with China is what I'm saying. Be skeptical of these narratives. Don't fall for it because we don't have the benefit of looking back and seeing all the facts in hindsight.
Warships to travel closer and closer to China's shores and to begin promoting a $27 billion plan, which is in an idea phase, to install a chain of missiles just outside of China's 9-dash line. That's a pretty interesting one also because one of the biggest producers of anti-China propaganda was ASPI, a think tank funded by weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Boeing, and more. They produce China threat stories, then they profit from China threat prevention. A bit of a conflict of interest, to say the least. So now I'll be living here in Xinjiang with my kids, potentially surrounded by American weapons of mass destruction. And you don't have to imagine too hard what would happen if Cuba hosted missiles from an American rival. With this kind of massaging of public opinion, when this kind of massaging of public opinion and consent happens, followed by actions like this, it's time for all of us to worry. Softening the public up for war may not be the explicit intention this time, but we're getting awfully close to a point where it takes one small spark or mistake to snowball into a war unlike anything the world has ever seen before.
Especially with the new AUKUS alliance, especially with the U.S. Making these deep ties with Australia, who's their ally that is the closest to China, not even that close to China, but you saw recently AUKUS where the U.S. formed this trilateral alliance with the U.K. and Australia, military alliance. And then you also saw this 60 Minutes Australia episode, basically 60 straight minutes of fear-mongering about China and pushing the Australian people towards war with China. You're seeing a strengthening of the imperialist alliance between Australia and the U.S. And a heightening of hostility and aggression towards China. Very dangerous, and I was talking about how dangerous that is on American soil, right? But of course, it is the most dangerous for the targets of imperialism, the countries who the U.S. wants to bomb and do economic warfare against and potentially invade. So, and he's noticed that as someone living in China with his family in China.
And as for the Uyghurs, the specific measures being taken, such as sanctioning projects made in Xinjiang by saying it's made with slave labor without any actual evidence, well, ironically, it will take away the livelihood of those Uyghurs. And it's created an interesting situation where I now see foreign China watchers complaining that Uyghurs need to travel out of province in order to find work, which is a kind of cultural genocide, they say, without any sense of irony that the West is compounding this problem.
And we talked about this in the last Daniel Dumbrill video that we covered where the U.S. sanctions were actually stopping Uyghur people from being able to work and preventing them from going to their job. And because the sanctions stopped those firms from exporting commodities, which took away the Uyghurs' jobs on the ground and actually made life worse for them, which is what sanctions are designed to do. They're designed to starve out a people, make their living conditions worse, so then they'll help the U.S. or whatever Western country overthrow their government. So yeah, great video over there from Daniel Dumbrill, as always. Totally unsurprised, of course. But all right, we got another video in the chat. What is this? Here's your video.
So I got a lot of
Oh, I love this guy. This guy messages me a lot. He's a beast.
requests of people asking me to talk about the people that testified against China. This woman's name is Tersine Ziwawudin. She's one of the ethnic Uyghur women that works for World Uyghur Congress.
World Uyghur Congress is like one of the main, sort of U.S. State Department linked think tanks pushing this. So it's a really good article on Consortium News, World Uyghur Congress. So here it is. Inside the U.S.-backed World Uyghur Congress. This will show where a lot of this money is coming from, and how the U.S. has been backing this like East Turkestan separatist movement in China, the ETIM. So lots of great information in that article that we don't have to go over right now. But
Uyghur Human Rights Project, pretty much indirectly working for the NED. And she's been most
NED.
prominently featured on BuzzFeed and BBC articles. According to CNN, she was...
So this is a good point here too for how they cook up propaganda. So it's like, you know, it's hard to imagine how can US media be so insular, right? How can they all be pushing a story if that story isn't really true or if there's no evidence for that story? Well, one, you have to realize how insular U.S. media actually is and how they're not going to report anything that the State Department doesn't really want them to report. But then they'll take stuff like this, right? So the World Uyghur Congress will have these, people they're funding who are pushing this narrative, and then you'll have like CNN, BuzzFeed, BBC, whoever else will interview these people from the World Uyghur Congress, and then it's a story, right? Not only one story, it might be like 20 different news stories, right, from one source, which is directly connected to the U.S. State Department. So you have the State Department push these sources through like the NED or through these NGOs like the NED, these non-governmental organizations that aren't directly connected to the State Department, or even like Human Rights Watch, which is a human rights NGO with CIA members and you know, wealthy capitalists on their board. So they'll push out these stories, right? And then all of corporate media, all these outlets like CNN and BuzzFeed, will take these stories, all coming from the same source or very similar sources, all tied to the State Department, and then push them as fact. So that's here you're seeing, you know, these people directly connected to the World Uyghur Congress, CNN and BuzzFeed and these other sources took these people and used it to make multiple articles claiming that there's a genocide going on.
Was a former teacher, and she was alleging gang rape and torture of women inside China's detention centers. And these allegations were made around February 2021. However, back in February 15, 2020, over here, her story was, to be honest, it wasn't that bad, she said. We had our phones, we had meals in the canteens, other than being forced to stay in there. Everything else was fine. So, not only did she change her story from between 2020 and 2021, but in 2019, the Chinese government issued her a passport. So are you telling me that a government that is trying to...
So this is the actual one that Daniel Dumbrill was talking about. So when she was apparently locked up is when the Chinese government issued her a passport. That is insane. And it's like, you know, this is why it's hard too to look at, or like for everyone on the left to be privy to narratives like this, because it's like you see these CNN reports about, you know, genocide going on, and, you know, your first instinct is to believe them. Be like, oh, that's horrible. You know, I wish I could do something to help. Not everybody is going to look so deep into the sources, right? Or look so deep into the where these outlets are getting their sources from that they're going to find stuff like this, right? They're not going to... Not everybody's going to dig through every source until they find the inconsistencies in the sourcing. So shout out to people like this. Shout out to people like Daniel Dumbrill. And
systematically
the journalists over at the Gray Zone who question this stuff and break down these media outlets for us. Doing great work.